As we try to enter more and more deeply into theosophical life and knowledge, we often feel the need to ask ourselves, why do we have such a wish to find theosophical ideas in the intellectual life of our time? Such a question comes to our mind quite naturally and effortlessly, and the word that then clarifies, and more than clarifies, our feelings in this regard is the word responsibility. Responsibility. This word is more than adequate to exclude any thought from our mind that suggests that we are involved with theosophy out of some kind of need to satisfy a personal longing. If we then try to understand, even without formulating our thoughts very clearly, what this word responsibility signifies for us in relation to the spiritual impulse of theosophy, we will come to see ever more clearly that we owe it to present-day humanity and our best efforts to serve it to concern ourselves with theosophy. We should not study theosophy purely for our own pleasure, or in order to satisfy some kind of personal longing by doing so. But on the contrary, we must feel that it is something that present-day humanity needs if the process of human evolutionary development is to go forward. We need to keep firmly in mind that without theosophy, or whatever we may like to call it, without that spiritual life that we envisage, earthly humanity will be faced with a desolate future, a truly desolate future. I say this for the simple reason that all the spiritual impulses of the past that have been given to mankind are exhausted, have gradually fulfilled their potential, and are unable to bring new seeds for human evolution. If only the old impulses were to continue to have an influence, the future prospect would inevitably be one where, to an unprecedented degree, technology of a purely external kind will not only overpower and outwardly overwhelm human beings, but will paralyze them and take them over even to the point of utter destruction, because it will drive from the human soul everything of a religious, scientific, philosophical, and artistic nature, and also any kind of higher moral feeling. People will become something like living automatons if new spiritual impulses are unable to take hold. Thus, when we think of theosophy, we must feel that we have been led by our karma to have some awareness of mankind's need for new impulses. With this in mind, we may ask ourselves what each one of us, with our particular questions and abilities, can do out of this overall sense of responsibility. In order to answer this deeply felt question, it may perhaps be particularly instructive for you, my dear friends, to consider the way in which theosophy came into the world in recent times, and how it has developed over the course of the last few decades until now. We should never forget that there is something of the nature of a cultural miracle about the way that the word theosophy came to prominence amidst the modern age. This spiritual miracle is connected with a personality who is strongly linked to you, my dear friends, in that she did, in a certain sense, have her spiritual roots from among your own people. I am referring to Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. No one in Western Europe would dispute the thought that the body in which the individuality who was in this incarnation called Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was dwelling could only have derived from Eastern Europe, and specifically from Russia, for she had all the Russian characteristics. But she was taken away from you through circumstances of a quite particular kind, in that the particular karmic conditions of the present time led her to the West. Let us consider for a moment what kind of extraordinary cultural miracle she represented. In many ways, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was a figure who throughout her life remained like a child, indeed like a real child. Never at any point did she learn to think logically, nor did she learn to keep her passions, desires, and longings under the least degree of restraint, and at any time they were prone to extreme degrees of excess. And she had very little scientific training of any kind. Through this personality, and it was perhaps inevitable that it was through the medium of a personality who was chaotic, confused, as well as colorful, a comprehensive body of the most sublime eternal wisdom appertaining to humanity was revealed to the world. Anyone who is well versed in these matters will find in Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's works elements of wisdom, truth, and knowledge which were completely incomprehensible to the intellect and soul of Blavatsky herself. If one considers the facts without prejudice, it is absolutely clear that as regards everything she wrote, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's intellectual faculties were merely the means whereby great and significant spiritual powers were able to communicate with mankind. It is equally clear that no one in Western Europe could have been the recipient of these impressions in the way that they needed to be received at the beginning of the last third of the 19th century. It needed the quite particular nature of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, which was on the one hand selfless, almost devoid of self, and on the other hand thoroughly self-centered and egotistic, in order that what indeed occurred could be brought about by higher spiritual powers. The selfless part of her nature was necessary, because a Western European mind would have transformed what had been revealed to it into its own thought forms, its own intellectual substance, while the self-centered aspect was also necessary, because amidst the crudely materialistic Western European way of life, there was no alternative but to clothe the tender hands whose task it was to nurture and cultivate the occultism of the modern age with iron fists, forged from such an extreme temperament. It is a remarkable phenomenon. But, my dear friends, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky made her way to the West. She went to that part of the civilized world which, with the exception of America, is as regards its whole particular nature, structure, and configuration, the most thoroughly materialistic area of our present time, and which in its language and its thinking lives to an extreme degree in materialistic thoughts and feelings. It would take me too long to explain which power it was that led Helena Petrovna Blavatsky to England, and so we see that the wealth of occultism that came so miraculously to expression through a medium, and I am not implying any spiritistic connotations, was directed initially toward the west of Europe. Within this Western European context, the destiny of this occultism was sealed in a certain direction, for with the founding of the Theosophical movement in this materialistic European West, a significant karmic obligation also came to fulfillment. Western Europe has a considerable karmic debt, and it cannot penetrate the mysteries without this karmic debt becoming apparent in some way or other. Whenever occultism becomes part of a situation, karma is immediately intensified, and forces are brought to the surface which otherwise remain hidden. What I now have to say is said in order to describe the actual situation, and is not intended as a criticism. In the course of carrying out something that was an historical necessity, the European West committed innumerable injustices against the bearers of the spiritual culture of olden times, the bearers of the ancient occult mysteries, as a result of which these spiritual forces have become ossified and have ceased to be available, although they live on in the depths of the soul. This is indeed the case in India and South Asia. As soon as occult impulses came to Western Europe, a reaction immediately began to manifest itself against the spiritual forces active in the depths of Indian culture, and it became impossible, it had already become so in Blavatsky's time, to sustain what certain spiritual powers had intended to be the spiritual movements necessary for our time. This simply became impossible. The intention had been to give mankind a wealth of occult teachings which could be suitable for all people, for all hearts, teachings to which each and every one could respond. But since it had become necessary to transplant the impulse to Western Europe, an egotistical reaction came about. those spiritual powers that wanted to give the world a new impulse, irrespective of any kind of human differentiations, were thrust into the background, and India, whose occultism had initially been suppressed, took karmic revenge by pervading, at its first opportunity, the occultism that had appeared in the West with its own national egotistic occultism. This occurred during Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's lifetime. It was already happening when she was formulating the great truths and wisdom contained in her book titled The Secret Doctrine. Her first work, titled Isis Unveiled, demonstrates the chaotic, illogical, passionate, and confused nature of her being. But throughout the book there is the indication that powers wanting to guide her toward a universally human purpose were watching over her. The Secret Doctrine, in addition to its undisputed elements of greatness, is pervaded throughout by particular human interests emanating from certain occult centers, which do not have universal human interests in view, but more parochial interests. Modern Tibetan, Indian, and also Egyptian initiations are invariably focused on more parochial concerns and wish merely to take revenge on the Western world for suppressing Eastern occultism, and for the fact that the West conquered the East through materialistic means. It did conquer the East through factors of this nature, but only insofar as Christianity was received into the truly progressive stream of human evolution. Christianity did not reach the East from Asia, nor did it emanate from Asia to the south. The direction of its movement was toward the West. Now, my dear theosophical friends, you may well say that this is all fine. The West went on to accept Christianity, and since Christianity is a stage in the advancement of mankind, it is only natural that the West should have been victorious over the East. If only this were so. If this is how things really were, the consequences would indeed follow. But it is not. Christianity, which has come into the world after hundreds and thousands of years of preparation, has never yet prevailed anywhere on the earth. And anyone who believes that he could, in any real sense, represent the Christ principle and the Christ impulse in our time, would have succumbed to indescribable arrogance. What is it that has really happened? Simply that the peoples of the West have embraced certain purely external features of Christianity, taken possession of Christ's name, and clothed their old cultures that were indigenous before Christianity came to Europe, warlike cultures that have been transformed into modern industrialism, with Christ's name. Does Christ truly reign in Christian Europe? No one who belongs to an occult movement would ever accept that Christ rules over Christian Europe. Rather would he say that you speak of Christ in quotes, but you are really referring to what the ancient populations of Central Europe meant when they spoke of their god Saxnot. The symbol of the crucifix hovers over the peoples of Europe, but in a certain sense what really rules over them are the traditions of the god Saxnot, whose symbol is the erstwhile short Saxon sword, which embodied the expansion of material interests. For that was the particular calling of the European tribes. Readers aside, Saxnot is spelled S-A-X-N-O-T, end of readers aside. This preoccupation, therefore, also gave rise to the noblest flowering of materialistic culture, chivalry. In no other culture is there anything resembling the chivalry of Western culture. It would not occur to anyone to compare the heroes of the Trojan War with medieval knights. So Christ is not much in evidence in people's lives. They merely speak about him. Thus, when Westerners speak about Christ, Eastern peoples feel that they, the Eastern peoples, know far more about the spiritual understanding of the world and about the mysteries of existence. The Eastern peoples are well aware of this. It is not difficult to see that the Eastern peoples are well able to appreciate their superiority in a spiritual respect. What do most Western people do today when mysteries of existence are being revealed? Well, we sit together in very small groups when we speak of the all-prevailing spiritual powers and mysteries which surround us everywhere, as we did yesterday evening. As far as ordinary Western Europeans are concerned, this is sheer folly or madness, for they are still unable to understand Paul's words to the effect that what is wisdom to God is often foolishness to human beings, and what people regard as foolish is regarded as wisdom by God. And only those whose minds have been infected by Western Europeans in the East would dream of quibbling in the least about the deep truths concerning the spiritual mysteries of the cosmos that I have been trying to reveal here, were they to hear them. For to those involved with the spiritual life of the East, such things as I was saying yesterday, for example, would be regarded as self-evident. So we should not be surprised that when they are assailed by Europeans, these Eastern peoples experience this as if they were being attacked by a herd of wild animals, and defend themselves accordingly, while not feeling offended by behavior which they regard as the fruit of an inferior attitude. For the reasons that I have indicated, whether or not they are justified is of no relevance at this point. And from the traditional Eastern point of view, we Westerners are regarded by adherents of Brahmanism, for example, as beings who are quite obviously inferior. If we turn from Brahmanism and consider, for instance, the cultures of Central Asia, of Tibet and China, cultures which will, in the near future, have a significance for the world that would seem inconceivable to people today, even though if we develop an awareness of this situation and realize that the souls of many of Zarathustra's pupils are even now incarnated in these cultures, it will not be long before this happens. We will need to take these matters very seriously. We shall also be able to see that in everything that Helena Petrovna Blavatsky communicated, occultists from India, Tibet, and Egypt were endeavoring to impart their own heritage of wisdom through her soul, although as regards its essential nature, this wisdom belongs to a previous era of human evolution. Indeed, we must recognize this outdated nature of the Oriental wisdom in Blavatsky's teachings. We should, moreover, not deny the significance of the fact that were Chinese culture to break its fetters and flood the Western world, it would bring with it a spirituality that in many respects is the unadulterated successor of ancient Atlantis. The effect of this would be equivalent to something that had been held back and has the capacity to spread throughout the world being released. And on a small scale, this is what the old culture of India has taken the opportunity to do. As a result, my dear theosophical friends, there was an initial instance of the application of a principle that is of significance for any occultist. And this meant that the theosophical movement was no longer a suitable instrument for the further evolution of European culture. Every occultist is familiar with this principle, which states that no special interest of whatever kind should ever be allowed to override the general interests of mankind, either amongst the guiding powers of occultism or on the part of anyone active in an occult movement. It is impossible to be effective in the occult realm if a particular interest outweighs the universal interest of humanity as a whole. The moment that a parochial interest enters the occult domain in place of universally human interests, the way lies open for genuine errors to occur. It was therefore possible at that time for all sorts of errors to enter the theosophical movement. Because of the way that England and India are related on a karmic level, the opportunity arose for those sublime powers that were present at the outset of the theosophical movement to be falsely impersonated. For it is quite normal in occultism that powers bent on pursuing their own special interests take on the form of those who have previously given the true impulses. Thus, from a certain time in the unfolding of the theosophical movement, it became completely impossible simply to accept everything that was going on within it. And it was karmically decreed that it became ever less possible to do so. As a result, when we were called upon to join forces with the Theosophical movement, there was nothing for it but to return to its original sources, which, as we can clearly state, are of a universally human nature, and not serving any particular interest. You may therefore have seen that we try in Central Europe to approach the occult sources in such a way that you will not find anything associated with any special interest in what you encounter. If you compare whatever in Central Europe is tinged with special interests with what you know of the theosophy that we pursue here, these two elements are mutually incompatible. Apart from the fact that my books are written in German, and they have to be written in a language of some kind, you will find nothing distinctively German in this theosophy, nothing that is in some way connected with the outward traditions of Central Europe. Whenever there is a tendency to connect theosophy with interests of a parochial nature, you immediately arrive at an impossible situation. It has been the particular task of Central Europe to free theosophy from the specialized characteristics that it has received in the European West. It was our mission to release it from all trace of such interests. And the further you delve into such matters, you will find that I was myself in a position to separate everything that I was enabled to bring of a theosophical nature from any sort of parochial interest. There is, my dear theosophical friends, something symbolic about the fact that I needed only to allow myself to be guided by what lived as a direct impulse in my present incarnation, and I trust that I shall not be misunderstood, as I am merely stating what actually occurred, in that those people who were the physical bearers of the blood that represents my line of descent originated from the German part of Austria, and I could not be born there. I was actually born in a Slavic region, which was completely alien to the whole environment from which my ancestors came. Thus, from the very beginning of my present incarnation, and I am merely offering a characteristic example, it was symbolically impressed upon me that in Central Europe our task was to extricate theosophy from any kind of special interest, so that in Central Europe it may indeed appear before us as a goddess, as a divine being who has been set free from human qualities, and who has, on an ongoing basis, just as much to do with people living in one place as with those living somewhere else. This ideal of ours, my dear theosophical friends, will, for all its apparent simplicity, need to be in the forefront of our minds, since it is more difficult to implement it than to talk about it. It must stand before us as our ideal of truth and sincerity, unalloyed divine truth. If we make efforts of this kind, we may perhaps not for ourselves, but on behalf of that impersonal quality that Central Europe can contribute to the whole mission of Europe, find the path whereby this divine theosophy can find its way to the East. And if I now go on to describe how theosophy has taken hold in the West, is being transmitted through Europe, and now needs to come to the East, I should like once again to give strong emphasis to the word responsibility, to having a real sense of responsibility. The cultures in the world evolve in such a way that one culture develops with another as though within a spiritual sheath. One culture forms a connection with another. Because theosophy in Central Europe had to be so impersonal, its spiritual character has come to be one that is devoid of attachment to any special interests. As a result, my dear theosophical friends, there is something aloof about this theosophy, an aloofness that comes from being untouched by such interests. And so it will not appeal to those who cannot open their hearts to something that does not serve some kind of particular interest. However, the spiritual quality that is possessed by this theosophy can indeed be found by souls who thirst and long for it. And at this point I may say, my dear theosophical friends, that I have from the spiritual world itself become acquainted with a soul that has a great longing for the Spirit that comes to expression through theosophy. I came to know this soul in the purely spiritual world. If we ascend in the sequence of the hierarchies to the individual folk spirits and speak amongst the various folk spirits of the folk souls, amidst the folk souls who are, so to speak, still young and who must evolve further, we find the Russian folk soul. I know that this Russian folk soul longs for the Spirit that finds expression in theosophy. It longs for it with all the forces which it can muster. I have been speaking here of a sense of responsibility because you, my dear theosophical friends, are children of this Russian folk soul. It exerts its power and influence within you, and you have a responsibility toward it. This responsibility is something that you must learn. Do not take it amiss if I say that this Russian folk soul has frequently had occasion to tell me many, many things. The most tragic of these communications was what the Russian folk soul was able to tell me around the year 1900. It appeared in a particularly tragic light at that time, because what I was able to see then was something that I could rightly interpret only long afterward, namely, that this Russian folk soul is understood today to a very limited degree. In Western Europe we have learned a great deal from Russia, and there is much that has made an enormous impression upon us. We have become familiar with the great impulses of Tolstoy, the deep psychological insights of Dostoevsky, and, latterly, the figure of Soloviev, a man who, if we become aware of what he is really saying, always gives us the impression that what he writes is who he is. And we see his writings in their true light only if we sense that the Russian folk soul is standing behind him. Moreover, the Russian folk soul has far more to say than Soloviev himself manages to say, for there is in this far too much of what has been assimilated from Western Europe. Think, my dear friends, of this word responsibility, and call to mind that you have this task of making yourselves worthy of the Russian folk soul, and that you need to recognize its longing for impersonal theosophy. When you have come to recognize theosophy in what lives in your innermost impulses, you will have all sorts of questions which can only arise from within a Russian soul, questions that address the spiritual questions of theosophy. I have experienced so much in the way of noble, lofty, and beautiful feelings that have come toward me from Eastern Europe, so much true human love and goodness, compassion and overflowing feelings as can be attributed only to a delicate and intimate observation of what lives in the world, and an intensely personal relationship with the ruling powers of existence. Out of such deeply intimate, beautiful, and noble feelings, many questions have been put to me by those belonging to the Russian people, questions which must be asked, because unless they are answered, mankind will not be able to go on living in the future. Questions that can only come from Eastern Europe have hitherto been posed to me only by the Russian folk soul on higher planes. I often felt obliged to think that the children of this folk soul still have a long way to go before they understand their folk soul, before they understand what this folk soul really longs for, and how much still separates them from it. Do not therefore hold back from seeking the path to your folk soul, for you will find it if that is what you really want. It is from your folk soul that you will discover those questions which must be answered if mankind is to have a future. But do not be afraid of reaching beyond personal interests, for you need to be mindful of the great responsibility that you have toward the Russian folk soul. For in future the folk souls will need the human beings who are their children to attain their objectives. And do not forget one thing, that power which can support a person at the highest level and can lead him to the most beautiful and most radiant heights of the world is most exposed to the danger of falling prey to errors. What you need to do, my dear theosophical friends, is to imbue the spiritual domain with soul. You can do this because the Russian folk soul has infinite depths and possibilities for the future. But it is necessary that you are conscious that the soul element that is able to raise itself to the spirit, and in this way to pervade it, exposes you to the great danger of losing yourself in purely personal factors and of being confined by them. The fact is that individual personal factors are reinforced when nourished by concerns of the soul. You will not be confronted by the obstacles that so frequently manifest themselves to Western and Central Europe. You have little inclination toward skepticism, which affects you only through Western influences. You will develop a certain feeling for distinguishing truths from untruth and dishonesty in the realm of occultism, where truth and charlatanism are so closely entangled with one another. Skepticism and cynicism do not pose any danger to you. Your danger will be that the powerful soul qualities of your personalities have a tendency to surround you with astral clouds, which prevent you from reaching through to the objectively spiritual domain. Your fire and your warmth are well able to envelop you with a cloud-like aura, which prevents the spirit from gaining access to you. Your very enthusiasm for the spirit hinders it from finding its way to you. But bear in mind that you have the great advantage, and I mean this in the ideal spiritual sense, of having the legitimate special interest that it is your destiny, that is, it is the destiny of your folk soul, to be able to receive theosophy, which people in Central Europe had to embrace as a divine power, elevated above all human concerns, as a special interest of the Russian people, in the way that no other people can receive it, as something that you can cherish and cultivate as your very own. For through your destiny you are well adapted to inspire the spirit with soul. This has often been said in our circles, but it is up to you to take the first possible opportunity not only to develop feeling and will, but also in a quite particular way, to cultivate energy and persistence, and, to speak in practical terms, to say less about how theosophy should be in the West than how it should be in Russia and elsewhere, and what is good in one situation or another, but rather resolve to unite yourselves with theosophy with all your heart and soul. The rest will follow from this. It will surely follow. This is, my dear friends, something of what I wanted to say to you. And I wanted to say it because whenever I am asked to speak, I am aware of the sense of responsibility that we people of our time have toward theosophy. In the West, people should have the feeling that they are committing a sin against humanity if they are able to receive something of theosophy and do not want it, reject it, a sin against humanity. It is sometimes very difficult to understand, for one must have an almost transcendental sense of duty, my dear friends, if one is to have such a feeling of responsibility toward mankind. Your folk soul tells you that it entrusts you with this obligation. It has already taken on this obligation toward mankind on your behalf. You need only find your way to it. You need only to allow your thoughts, feelings, and will impulses to speak. And if you have this feeling of responsibility toward the folk soul, you will at the same time be fulfilling this obligation toward mankind. It is for this reason that you are placed geographically between Western Europe, which must embrace theosophy, but for which it cannot be a personal matter to the degree that it is for you, and the Asiatic East, which has had occultism and spiritual culture since ancient times. You would perhaps never manage to fulfill your task in relation to the spiritual culture of mankind in this difficult situation in which you have been placed, if you had to think only of your obligation toward humanity. For the temptations become absolutely enormous if you bear in mind that you have, on the one side, the European West, which has caused many of the children of your folk soul to be untrue to themselves. Indeed, we may have the feeling that a large part of what has been written by Russians and then brought to us in the West has nothing to do with the Russian folk soul, but is a reflection of all manner of Western phenomena. The second temptation will come from the East, when the power of its spiritual culture emerges. It will then be your duty to know that for all the greatness of this spiritual culture of the East, people in our present age have to say to themselves, our task is not to bring the past into the future, but rather new impulses. We should not simply embrace any kind of spiritual impulse emanating from the East, but cultivate what the West can itself bring forth from spiritual sources. If you fulfill your obligations toward your folk soul, the time will come when Europe will begin to understand the essential nature of the Christ impulse within the spiritual evolution of mankind. It would be my wish, my dear friends, that through everything that I have sought to say, and through these words, and above all, through whatever in these words you are able to transform into impulses of your own, you will endeavor not merely to feel that theosophy is something of great significance, but above all else, take theosophy into your deeds and the will impulses of your soul, and direct your lives and actions accordingly. When we were gathered here last year, those who were present together with our Russian friends carried in their hearts as an unfolding bud, as it were, the awareness of something that has been developing over the course of the past year, and should live ever more strongly in your hearts, namely that theosophy, or as we also call it, anthroposophy, is not something that people should imbibe as another form of knowledge or belief system, but that it should, in a certain sense, take hold of the whole soul of each individual, and indeed the soul of the whole of humanity in our time. This awareness needs gradually to develop, and we should not think, or, what is more to the point, delude ourselves, that it will be easy to arrive at its full significance and potential. Only very gradually and slowly will we manage to achieve a real experience of the significance of the theosophical impulse. Such a truth may seem to be a matter of stating the obvious, but this is an instance where something that may appear quite trivial must be regarded with the utmost seriousness. Let us consider one particular aspect of the wealth of insights that arise from this way of looking at things. Thus it is, for example, nearly 2,000 years since the Christ impulse came down from higher worlds to earthly life, and it is a fact that the Gospels are one of the most widely distributed texts in the world, and moreover, that for many, many centuries, millions of human souls have believed that they have a right relationship to Christ. And yet, it is equally true that anyone who is truly honest, and is not immodestly ascribing to himself an understanding that he does not really possess, has to struggle in our time with the question, what in actual terms is the Christ impulse? All that such a person may hope for is to gain an understanding of the Christ impulse through new revelations from the spiritual world. To give a specific instance of this problem, I can relate that last year, together with some friends, I attended an Easter service of the Russian Orthodox Church. Immediately afterward, I tried to give expression to what I had experienced by putting it into words, so as to give you food for thought. What flowed forth from the service was a consciousness of the dead Christ, whereas the message that needs to flow to humanity for its salvation, both in our time and the future, is the eternally living Christ. And yet, when I thought about what lay at the background to that service, a different picture arose in my mind of what the individuals who did not measure up to the demands of this service were actually engaged in there. Thus I saw in the background of the service a tableau of ancient holy mysteries, which have evolved into what lives outwardly in the forms of this religious service. And although many people feel this in their hearts, the very people who ought to be, or consider themselves to be, the best qualified interpreters of these mysteries for our present time, have the least understanding of them. Try to ponder the thought that such examples engender ever more deeply, that theosophy proceeds from each individual heart, and that through theosophy or anthroposophy, something completely new needs to flow into human evolution. Try to engrave into your hearts the truth that the signs of the time are such that, at any rate in the quiet intimacy of our own hearts, we can never make any kind of compromise with what is around us. A new plant cannot simply arise out of an existing one, but can emerge only if the old plant dies, making it possible for a new plant to be formed out of one single point, namely the seed. Thus theosophy is, my dear friends, something that must develop in our hearts and souls as a completely new seed. And out of everything of which the old plant of humanity consists, it must retain only that which is universal, which we behold when we contemplate the mystery of Golgotha. The leaves and trunk of the ancient culture of humanity will have to fall. The blossom, the mystery of Golgotha, will have to remain as a memory of the seed which is to be developed through theosophy. In this seed, my dear friends, will need to be the bearer of the consciousness of bringing this blossom to its full maturity in ever renewed ways. The Christ impulse will then live in many forms over the course of human evolution, and yet ever be the same, just as every new flower bears within itself the power and beauty of the old flower. But at the same time it will be what it seeks to be in its innermost essence, something that arises in ever-renewed ways, an ever-renewed understanding of what was given as a new beginning of human evolution, when the blood flowed from the wounds of him who took on human form in order to experience death amongst mankind. My dear friends, all the worlds that we can traverse from our physical world through the higher worlds always have something in common. It is true that when we enter a higher world, we constantly find new things, but nevertheless, there is always a feature that is shared with the one before it. When we come to know the higher worlds, there is one thing that can exist only as a physical phenomenon, which is not to be found there. The gods of the higher worlds can experience many things, but the one experience that they cannot have is that of death. For death does not exist in the supersensible worlds. The beings in the supersensible worlds undergo transformation. They pass from one form into another. But one cannot die in the supersensible world. The physical phenomenon of death can only exist as a physical phenomenon. And among all the gods and spirits, the only one who, in order to share the destiny of mankind, has descended into the world of human beings, has been the Christ, who united himself with mankind not only through his life but through his death, from whence new life forces have streamed forth. Contemplation of the death on Golgotha must become the germinal point for ever new life forces, for what a God has willed to accomplish for humanity by means of an ultimate sacrifice is concentrated at one single point of human evolution, in this death. If you try to ponder this thought and let it become a living meditation, you will see that it can become the source of the strongest life forces for every human soul. Thus there is no more sublime picture than the cross erected on Golgotha. My dear friends, an infinite amount is connected with an imagination such as that of the cross on Golgotha for the whole of mankind. This symbol, which was at the same time an actual reality, has been in existence for well nigh 2,000 years, and we must increasingly learn to understand it over the future course of human evolution. These are simple, primitive thoughts, but their purpose is not to lead us into metaphysical speculations, but to engender feelings that can make us capable of approaching human evolution as a whole in the right way. You are aware, my dear friends, that human evolution is differentiated into distinct elements which take the form of individual nations and peoples. Each people has a quite particular basic character, which arises from the fact that it has as its leader one of those spirits whom we collectively designate as the hierarchy of the archangels. These archangels are the highest representatives of the various peoples. A spiritual outlook on the world must enable the human soul to establish in future an ever closer connection as an individual soul with the ruling folk soul from the rank of the archangels. And only if we come to understand what this folk soul is willing on our behalf, parenthesis, if this folk soul has an intention that it wants to develop for the future, close parenthesis, are we able to collaborate with it in an appropriate way in the spiritual evolution of mankind. In this respect, we need to make a firm distinction between the Western European folk souls and the East European Russian folk soul. I am not now speaking of the outward aspect of Russian culture, of what exists as Russian national culture on the outward physical plane. I am speaking of your folk soul, who is indeed present in the spiritual world, awaiting its future task, full of expectation, hope, and confidence. If one compares this folk soul with Western European folk souls, one has the impression of a youthful, aspirational being on the one hand, and old, sterile beings on the other. Central European culture has a mediating function between Western and Eastern Europe, which is fundamentally misunderstood if one equates it with the other cultures. This culture of Central Europe has the quite distinctive task of acting as a herald of past ages for later times. Just think, my dear friends, how the whole European culture of the Western world came into being. The advanced posts of the Oriental peoples had extended to ancient India and had developed a great all-pervasive culture there, as we encounter it in the ancient Indian culture from the time of the Bhagavad Gita. These peoples had migrated to southern Asia, whereas wise teachers such as the Rishis and Zarathustra taught amongst them. The peoples who resided in the wide expanses of the European countries, and also in your country, were, through the wisdom of world evolution, left behind in primitive conditions. In Asia there was a blossoming of far-reaching thoughts in the Sankhya and Vedanta philosophies, while these European peoples had simple primitive cultures. Why? Because any advance in cultural development is predicated on everything that arises subsequently as a new impulse being first received by people in a primitive state of development. The peoples of the East, who had risen to a certain height of intellectual development, could never understand the Christ impulse, for example. It was beyond the bounds of possibility for them to understand it. The peoples of Western culture had not yet come to the point of embracing the spiritual domain in an intellectual way. That which lives as a power radiating from the heart to the head had not in them extended to the head. In India, everything was a culture of the head, whereas among the European peoples, everything was still concentrated in the heart, in primitive feelings of primordial strength. It was only possible for such peoples gradually to assimilate the mystery of Golgotha into their feelings, because they had not gone beyond the soul qualities of the heart. Thus, because European culture had a fresh primal energy, through having remained behind, and fresh primal energies are most closely related to divine forces, it was the culture that was ready to receive the Christ impulse. So in the Western world, two streams flowed together, which for anyone who has any feeling for such matters are sharply to be distinguished from one another. There is a marked difference, for example, between the underlying tone of Fichte, the Central European philosopher, and the underlying tone of Spinoza, who was also a European philosopher. It can happen in human evolution that what belongs to the general culture of the time can be borne by the same individuality. For as some of our friends may know, the individuality of Spinoza reappears in Fichte. But as an individual personality of the 18th and 19th centuries, Fichte was imbued with the whole power of the Christ impulse, while Spinoza, who was the same individuality, stands in the other stream and has no connection with this impulse. There is, however, much that needs to enter European culture which is not yet present, and there must be an interaction between what has, in a certain sense, become old, and what is youthful and full of hopeful anticipation. The Russian folk soul, this being from the rank of the archangels, is young and full of hope. Its task lies before it. It will be the task of Russian theosophists to find the bridge from the individual soul to the folk soul, to learn to understand what the folk soul is wanting of them. You will find, my dear friends, that it will, given certain preconditions, be easy for you to bring the Christ impulse to life within your hearts, because of what lives within your souls. But on the other hand, you will also have to face the experience that because you have a certain inner proclivity for enlivening the Christ impulse, you will be exposed to great difficulties. You will have to experience to a high degree the profound truth that you will have to draw upon your inner resources and bring theosophy to life within your own hearts. For since theosophy is a message for our time, it will not make any compromises with other world conceptions. It therefore addresses other outlooks in a clear-cut way, in stern words which have been heard before in the course of evolution. Those who want to find theosophy amidst cultures that have hitherto had an outward materialistic character, and that is true of all cultures of the present, or at any rate virtually so, and seek to make a compromise with them, will hear resounding in all sternness the words of Christ Jesus, quote, "Let the dead bury their dead, follow me," close quote. What is meant by the dead here are the various cultures inclining toward materialism. They are well able to run themselves into the grave. Let the dead bury their dead. But human souls should be guided by their understanding of the spiritual impulse that pervades the world in the form of the Christ impulse. So, if you direct your inquiries toward old traditions and practices, you will, my dear friends, not find anything that leads you to theosophy. It is good to explore these old traditions in order to show how the divine world lives in them. But a person comes to theosophy today because his soul is not old and senile, but is like yours, fresh and direct, encountering theosophy in the way that you do, uninfluenced by any traditions. The theosophical impulse requires from your souls not only cognitive power, but living energy. My dear friends, many of you, perhaps most or even all of you, feel within yourselves, even though you may express it differently, the grief and sorrow of being temporarily separated from your folk soul. Many of you feel, even if your beliefs are otherwise, and again this may apply to most or perhaps all of you, that you need a new stimulus for your will and energies. Begin, or indeed resolve, to see, my dear friends, that what you experience so deeply as the sorrow of will and motivating forces that often seem so inadequate is the virginal quality of your will. Make a resolve to view this as a will that has remained untapped, and which is waiting to be stirred into action by the theosophical impulse. Let the theosophical impulse become a force of will within you. Try to transform sorrow into strength, your weakness of will into a theosophy that is a living power within you, and you will really be able to embark upon a theosophical life. Try to find a way of reinvigorating what is still weak in you and is not fully present. You will then become the best representatives of theosophy. And bear in mind that the souls which are now dwelling in your bodies are not destined only to reincarnate in Eastern Europe. They are destined to be spread throughout the earth in their next incarnations. And as you prepare for your new incarnation, in the course of your life, between life and death and a new birth, some words will be addressed to you. To some of you it will be said, quote, "You have fulfilled your task. You can take what you have received on earth, which could have been received only on Eastern European soil, into the world," close quote. To the others it will be said, quote, "You cannot," close quote. My dear friends, regard what you now feel for theosophy as an instinct for what I have just been saying, as a vague feeling that you have for what constitutes your task. If you think of it in such a way that it can give you strength that flows from your ego into your thinking, feeling, and will, from there into your life, and from there into your blood, you will be interpreting this instinct out of which you are now hastening toward theosophy in the right way. You are now assembled together here. Despite the great difficulties that exist in your country, you have managed to come together without impediment. Make use of this opportunity to foster a strong inner concord, so that each and every one of you can form a bridge to the folk soul. It cannot be my task, my dear friends, to speak in detail about which services should be rendered to this folk soul, but I can speak to you about something else, and I should like that you transform into a feeling what I am obliged to express in words. You are in a particular situation, my dear friends. You are in a certain sense in an opposite situation to a people who are dominating the earth for a brief period of increasing splendor. I am referring to the North American people. Consider, my dear friends, that these North American people, who are your opposites, began gradually to advance westward at the time when the age of materialism had begun in Europe, and they developed it further. You need to bear in mind that the roots of Americanism lie in materialism, and that the people who colonized America undertook this armed with the ideas of civilized Europe several centuries ago. What did these people do? They did what uneducated people otherwise do when they clear ancient forests, prepare the land area by area, and bring the soil into cultivation, but with the materialistic ideas of modern science and modern social organization. Everything arose out of materialism. Let us consider one of their most important writers, a man whom, moreover, the Americans have chosen as their leader, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is certainly a significant writer who has made some brilliant studies of social affairs. But if we really look at his concepts and ideas, and everything that he stands for, as the representative of the American people, what do we find? A house of cards. If a single breath from the spiritual worlds were to blow upon this house of cards, it would collapse, and the whole culture that it typifies would fall with it. Every detail that has gone into the making of American culture can be found in ordinary history books, in the culture of the preceding centuries. Everything is openly there to see, and everything that we find is man-made. If you ask yourselves where your national character, your spiritual life comes from, and what is the source of the best qualities that you cherish in your souls, you will not find it on the earth. It cannot be found in this way, for it originates in the spiritual world itself. This is no house of cards, but a living organism. We should never regard such things as a justification for arrogance, but rather as a reason for humility and modesty. For we should not be deriving from this a brazen self-consciousness, but a true sense of responsibility. My dear friends, I was speaking yesterday about freedom. A lot of water will have to flow under the bridges of Europe before a certain number of people fully understand what is meant by a freedom of this nature. What is freedom? Looking at this from the point of view of the extreme West, what is freedom to an American? It is what makes his life as comfortable as possible. He refers to freedom as that which needs to be incorporated into the social order so that every individual has the best chance to get on in the world. Our idea of freedom, says Woodrow Wilson, is different from that of Europeans, because we think of it in practical terms. This is what an American himself says about it. A knife is used to cut with and a fork to eat with because that is the practical thing to do. Americans espouse freedom because of its practical advantages, because it offers the best way of achieving what is agreeable to them. For Americans, freedom is a utility product. It brings them benefits. My dear friends, for Western Europeans, freedom has been something very different. It has been a high ideal, something that they have looked up to. It is worthy of being spoken of in poetic terms. For a European, it is a high and glorious goddess. For an American, it is a useful cow, which provides him with milk and butter. I am not advancing this view myself. It is put forward by the man who will be responsible for leading the United States of America. It is not my task to express an opinion of my own, but merely to be the interpreter of what lives in the spiritual world. The American version of freedom has been characterized here by an outstanding representative of the American people. Whereas, if we take into account all that heroic spirits in Europe have achieved in order to describe this divine freedom as a high, majestic goddess, this amounts to saying that all our enthusiasm, thoughts, and feelings go out toward the ideal of freedom that lived within these Europeans. But you need to understand, my dear friends, that freedom must become something quite different again for those who share in a spiritual view of the world. You would be seriously mistaken if you did not realize that everything must be fashioned anew. We are faced with the challenge that freedom must become altogether different from the high ideal that the best human minds have hitherto cherished. For we know that as human beings we shall shortly be granted access to a divine spring, that we will be enabled to drink water of the Spirit, and that this water will live in our souls, and that we shall have to ensoul freedom, just as we incorporate our soul in our body. Thus, on the one hand, freedom is a practical tool for outward life, and on the other a lofty spiritual ideal. But freedom needs to be a quality that is enshrined within the soul, and is higher than the soul, and moreover, to the same degree as the soul is higher than the body. We shall learn to ensoul freedom, which will be no small thing to learn. And then we will be able to go forward in accordance with the wishes of the eternal spiritual powers for human evolution through their having enabled theosophy to flow into your souls. It has been my wish, my dear friends, to share with you some simple words directed not to your intellect, but to your hearts, since you have found it possible to develop yourselves to theosophy, also outwardly within your country. So let us take the opportunity to make ourselves aware at this moment of the lofty task that has been given to us through a spiritual conception of the world. My dear friends, this consciousness will, if we are able to dwell within it, enable something to radiate forth from the quiet work in theosophical branches, which will have a healing influence for the whole country. For we will only begin to understand spiritual life once we know that it is not only what we can do outwardly for the spreading of theosophy that actually contributes toward this aim, but that when we work together, as well as we can, to achieve an understanding of theosophy, the effects of our spiritual endeavors stream forth imperceptibly. And just as we well know that a town where there is a theosophical lodge is, even if only a few people have been engaged in theosophical activity there, after 30 years quite a different place from one where there is no theosophical lodge, your country will become altogether different if you have an inner understanding of what theosophy can give you. I am not speaking to you as a Western European or as someone belonging to this or that nation. I know that that is not the case. But perhaps it is just for this reason that I am able to say to you that salvation will come to Russia, but this salvation is not something to be sought on a false path. Nor am I saying this because I love theosophy. I am saying this because the whole of human evolution can assure us that this is true. There is a path of salvation for Russia, and it lies through theosophy. For other regions of the earth, theosophy will be highly beneficial and a means of real progress. For Russia, theosophy will be the only salvation, something that is essential in order that this folk soul is not called upon to take on tasks in the world other than the one that is destined for it. With these words, I should like to inaugurate your newly founded branches, for I know that the holy significance of these words will be fully embraced within your hearts. It will then be possible for that connection to be established in your souls which is necessary for the salvation of your country. The connection of the mystery of Golgotha with the human understanding of this mystery. Then the Spirit who must become the regenerator of your country will reign in your hearts, and your gatherings will radiate forth what your earthly region needs. With such thoughts as these, and out of a sense of reverence for the guiding powers of human evolution, I should like to call down every blessing for your work, the blessing of those powers which make it possible for the mystery of Golgotha to flow into your hearts, so that this blessing continues to radiate from your souls and from your work into your country. And I know that this blessing is always present whenever we are worthy of it. So as we stand at the point of departure for our work, may the image of these thoughts hover over us as a new spiritual impulse, which must stream into human evolution, just as the spiritual leaders of this impulse hover over the work that we seek to carry out in all sincerity. Then from this image will arise the awareness that we are doing what must be done for a limited region, and hence also for the whole realm of human evolution. And so from this we know what we have to do. May, in this sense, the blessing of the wise leaders of the world and of humanity guide your work. May it arise powerfully within your souls as a source of light. For then this light will be able to radiate forth, and you will be able to accomplish much that is essential for healing, for progress, and for the true evolution of mankind. Question. There are people in Finland who have begun to doubt about the future of Finland. There are others who are full of enthusiasm for a future Finnish culture. Do you think that the guardian angel of Finland still has something to do in the world? Rudolf Steiner. It is probably as well that where such questions are concerned, it is a general rule among occultists not to answer them at any great length. It is wholly understandable that for an objective, open-minded judgment of many answers that we may be accorded from occult research, a high degree of impartiality is necessary, which, if I may emphasize this, we do not always find in practical life. Hence it is necessary that I am unable, even in this place, to answer this question, which concerns the social life of our present time and the forces living within it, in any greater detail than any other practicing occultist. What I am able to say regarding this question can be indicated in a few words along the lines of what I said when I was speaking about folk spirits in Christiania. I said then that the folk spirits of certain territories of smaller nations have a far greater significance for the future of mankind than one would generally suppose in the wider world today. Populations which have, in a certain sense, played less of a part in recent times in the, in quotes, great concert of European and world evolution, have for the time being been allotted the task of conserving certain significant aspects of human culture outside of the wider process of cultural development. Inasmuch as I have been able to concern myself with the cultural life of Finland, I can say that what I said in Christiania should be recognized as being true for Finland. I ask you not to regard this as something said to Finns by someone of German-speaking origin, who has the intention of saying something that is agreeable to them. It will never happen that I say something in order to please anyone or a group of people. It is simply that according to my conviction, that is, my research, it is true. If, insofar as this is possible for an occultist, as a non-Finn, one studies Finnish cultural development, one would have to say that, as regards its spiritual evolution, Finnish cultural life is among those cultures that will play a large part in the future cultural evolution of Europe. I say this quite objectively, irrespective of my nationality or the language that I speak. The most diverse folk spirits will have a contribution to make toward the future of the earth. But everything that we may recognize as what is most characteristic of Finnish cultural life has something about it which should not be absent in a future world culture, if this world culture develops in the ways that our occult knowledge would have us believe. The course of world evolution is such that as evolution advances, something that was already present in earlier cultural periods must at some later point be renewed or re-assimilated. For example, many things in our present fifth post-Atlantean cultural period have been derived from the Egyptian age. In the sixth cultural period, many things from the age of ancient Persia will re-emerge, and in the seventh from the ancient Indian culture. This ancient Indian culture, which lives on beneath the surface, will experience a mighty reawakening in the seventh post-Atlantean cultural period. What is the case on a large scale with respect to these repetitions also takes place amidst those populations that become the living guardians of certain spiritual forces in the course of evolution. Thus I am convinced that in the Finnish culture, some secret forces are concealed which are sensed today by the present population of Finland in connection with the renewal of the ancient sagas of the old culture of Finland, as I believe, and I say this quite explicitly, and that there is in all of this something of the greatest importance, which is in many respects still hidden, but which will emerge in its full significance, and more so than is the case at present, and will make an impact upon the future culture of mankind. I believe that there is some justification for repeating the assertion that Finnish culture will in future have something remarkably significant and light-filled about it. Again, I must emphasize that what I have said represents my own conviction, and is said, so I believe, out of my occult knowledge, and not in order to flatter anyone. I would just as easily have said something unpleasant if it had been the truth. Question. The Kalevala shows us that it is justified to speak of a past spiritual culture of Finland. A culture presupposes a higher influence. Hence one can perhaps speak of ancient Finnish mysteries. Do you know anything about the nature of these mysteries? Would you say something about them? Rudolf Steiner. It is easily possible to understand that someone who knows the Kalevala only through a translation will inevitably overlook certain details which are highly important for the effect of such an epic poem. But this epic poem, the national poem of Finland, appears to someone who considers it in an occult light as something of such significance and so clearly arising out of occult antecedents that there would be some justification for recognizing its occult background, even if one cannot enter into the great beauties that can of course be discerned only in the language of the original poem. What is distinctive about the Kalevala is that its occult foundations are immediately obvious. For me, this was highly striking. I am saying this here, although it will be necessary to repeat some of these thoughts in my public lecture the day after tomorrow. When I first encountered the three heroes of the great Finnish national epic, who are so well known to you, Vainamoinen, Ilmarinen, and Lemminkainen. Forgive me if I sometimes make mistakes in the pronunciation. It is quite understandable if one doesn't manage to pronounce such a difficult language as Finnish perfectly. When one encounters these three heroes, as an occultist, one immediately ceases to speak of ordinary heroes, as the word is often used in other national epics. It was striking for me to discover three quite distinct things behind these three principal heroes. As you know, in my book titled Theosophy, there is a description of the full extent of human soul life in its three main aspects, which is in accordance with what is given in the oldest European mysteries, and is fully in harmony and agreement with the Rosicrucian mysteries of modern times. And I call them the sentient soul, the intellectual or mind soul, and consciousness soul. We should think of human evolution in such a way that these soul members developed one after the other. Firstly, the sentient soul developed in the three sheaths of the physical body, ether body, and astral body. Later, the intellectual or mind soul developed on its foundation, and the richest fruit of this evolution is the consciousness soul. We must imagine that behind everything that happens in the physical world, and therefore also behind man's participation in these forces, there are spiritual beings. Thus, behind the physical world in which we human beings live, we must envisage the spiritual bestowers and bearers of the forces of our sentient soul, our intellectual or mind soul, and our consciousness soul. I cannot now enter into these details, but it became an absolute certainty to me that Vainamoinen can be recognized as the bearer, the giver, the bestower of man's sentient soul. So that everything that we refer to in European theosophy as the forces of the sentient soul must appear as a gift of the spiritual being who bears the name of Vainamoinen in the Kalevala. These things do not merely have an historical context, for in this historical dimension there is always a place for occult forces. That is not to say that behind these personalities there are not also historical heroes, but what lies within these heroes is something that we are obliged to recognize. The bestower of the consciousness soul is Lemminkainen. Because he is the bestower of the consciousness soul, Lemminkainen is in what might be called a Dionysian situation. For if one knows the mystery of the state of being dismembered amidst the world expanses, it is remarkable to find in the Kalevala the incident of the dismembering of Lemminkainen. Thus, when we enter into these elements of the Kalevala, we find what we portray in theosophy with regard to soul development, which itself derives from the oldest mysteries of Europe, and preeminently from the northern mysteries, but is also in accordance with the Rosicrucian and Grail mysteries, everywhere expressed in mighty pictures, which precisely because they have a pre-human or superhuman aspect, expand into immense proportions. Thus, even this purely external circumstance makes us aware of what lies behind this poem, for in its mighty pictures it reflects ancient holy truths of the mysteries, which have their origin in the deepest mysteries of the European North. Although I cannot go into further detail here, it must be acknowledged that this is the ultimate source of what we find expressed in this poem. This is apparent, for example, from even a cursory study of the way that the creation of the world, prior to the appearance of man, is described in the first runes. This corresponds to everything that is contained in the European mysteries about the origin of the world, albeit expressed in majestic images. These are the embodiments of truths deriving from the mysteries, in the way that an earlier consciousness had received them. Additionally, it is also possible to verify from occult history, from the Akashic record, the direct connection between these Finnish imaginations. I am now being careful to speak of the imaginations underlying the Kalevala, with the pictures that have been given in the old European mysteries about the marriage of heaven with the earth. Thus we encounter what we may recognize as an interaction between the upper and lower regions in the sense of the mysteries in the first rune.